You're listening to The Resilient Animal. I'm Annie Petersen, Doctor of Education with a Master's in Mental Health Recovery and Trauma-Informed Care. This podcast is an exploration of how helping other living beings can benefit human mental health and well-being, and what makes us all resilient animals. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Resilient Animal Podcast. Today, I am joined by Dr. Janet Hoy-Gerlach from Open Door Veterinary Collective, and thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Annie. Please feel free to call me Janet.
I will. So, Janet, I was hoping before we start talking about the collective, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to work in the animal field.
Sure, happy to. So, I actually am a social worker by profession and by training. I've been a quote unquote animal person my whole life. I don't know that that was ever like a conscious choice. I just gravitated to playing with like little toy animals instead of like toy dolls and action figures and things. Or if I did with those, they had animals. They had pets or were animal companions, and was obsessed with all the neighborhood animals. I actually wasn't born into a family that had animals. I just sort of was like that and pestered my parents relentlessly until they gave in, and we got a kitten named Princess when I was 8, who was wonderful and didn't know any better. So we went for walks together around the block on a leash. I was this weird little kid. Like, and I say we went for walks together because really I did not train her. She just walked next to me. I put a little leash on her, and we would walk together. She would follow me. She was this
That's
little
pretty
black
forward
cat.
thinking, because I know that leashes on cats, that didn't become super popular until just
Mm,
recently. And so you were doing
I
it
no
as a
one
kid.
told you no one told either of us otherwise. We didn't know any better. So just seemed like a good idea until we ran into 3 loose dogs. Thank goodness a neighbor stepped in and helped us. And I still remember my kitty climbed all the way to the top of her head and sat on her head, and she just let her stay up there, kind of held her so she would, and like walked us home. Yeah, so I became a bit of a horse obsessed teenager, and we didn't have enough money to have horses or anything, but I mucked stalls so I could have riding lessons, and eventually got to where I was riding other people's horses to help exercise them, did a bit of showing, training, that kind of thing. And kind of alongside that was my growing interest in social work. So got an undergraduate degree in social work and undergraduate degree in social work and a license. And my first job doing that, I was doing outreach with folks who were unhoused, many of them struggling with addiction and chronic mental health issues. And some of them had animals who they'd had before they'd lost housing. Some of them had animals they'd actually encountered on the street in trouble, or just sort of on their own, and started sort of caregiving them. So that's when my dot kind of first started to connect. And then the light bulb fully went on a few years later when I was doing a job where I was doing full-time risk assessments for folks with going through suicidal periods where they were having serious thoughts, plans, and there's a whole protocol for professional risk assessment. I did not create it. I can't take credit for the questions. One question that we would always ask, my colleagues and I, in doing a risk assessment with somebody, is the question, what's stopped you up until now from acting on your suicidal thoughts, your plans? And again, that's standard, not my question. And we would get the kinds of answers that I've been trained to listen for in my education and in continuing licensure education, training, supervisions, workshops, reading, all the ways that you learn professional helping skills. And we would get, me and my colleagues, we'd get the usual sort of responses we've been taught to listen for. So things like, I can't leave my kids. I don't know what would happen to them, or I wouldn't want to harm my parents or my family that way, or my friends, against my faith, my religious beliefs. That's certainly one that comes up regularly. So kind of the usual things that in research literature we would call protective factors, right? Like the things that sort of help protect us against moving forward on suicidality. So the usual things. However, on a regular basis, not just me, but my colleagues would encounter folks who would say, and probably anyone listening to this podcast is not going to be remotely surprised by what I say next, but folks on the regular would say, I can't leave my pet. And that's what's stopping me. Like literally, that is the reason for folks. And again, certainly not every day, but regularly. People literally telling me the reason that they were literally still alive, speaking with me instead of not alive, having acted on their suicidality, was because of their animals.
Right.
And two things about that hit me. First of all, as a person who's kind of quote unquote an animal person, like I got it, like on a very just basic gut, like I got how you could be that powerfully attached, bonded, pick your word, to another living being who is not a human being, but another living being, to the point that you would stick around, stay alive, even going through excruciating pain or all the things that get people to that point where they're considering suicide, that attachment to that animal could be powerful enough that they were trying to stick around. It made sense to me from that standpoint. As a mental health clinician, right? As somebody trained to listen for these protective factors, things that people are self-identifying as their lifelines from like their perspectives. We're never wanting to approach somebody saying, oh, well, you shouldn't feel this. You have all these things to live for, blah, blah, blah. What we want to do is listen very deeply and then be very responsive and try to build around that as a strength, whatever that is for that person. And people regularly telling me pets, and yet nowhere in my training, in my education, my continuing education workshops, had it ever even been brought up as something that we should ask about, like, do you have an animal? Let alone, is that animal helpful for you in some way and or stressful? Because like any relationship, these are mixed bags. Even the best relationships have stressors. And so part of maximizing the benefits is helping to reduce those strengths. What does that person need to maximize whatever it is was a resource that's helping keep them going?
Right.
Be that maybe it's their faith, but they're having trouble getting to their faith community. The building moved across town, or trying to figure out where are the barriers? How do we build into that?
Yeah.
For that person.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I love that you recognized that you were open enough to see, hey, there's a real correlation here between what is keeping people going and something that is beyond the research or beyond the training. So I really appreciate that you recognized that and decided to make that a focus.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think there's a lot of, when I say this, like very rarely are people like, really? That's so strange. I would never, always it's things like what you say, like, oh, People who work in the field are like, oh yes, like, and they'll have multiple instances. And I guess that's part of what was so almost shocking to me. Like, this isn't, I don't necessarily like the phrase like low hanging fruit, but I mean, it wasn't rocket science to simply ask people about their animals. And then for people where that is an important part of their support or their well-being, many people, that's considered part of their family, like, then be responsive. Not that I'm an animal service professional. I'm very clear about that. I'm not. I'm a human service professional. However, part of what I do is work across disciplines, across professions. I work with primary care doctors. I work with addiction specialists. I work with housing, physical therapists, all sorts of folks. Why was there this glaring omission of, like, why weren't we reaching out across to animal welfare professionals to help support this, for many people, very, in some cases, life saving, and in other cases, life threatening sort of consideration? Because the flip is also true. People will, I mean, I guess it's not too dramatic to say people will stay up, live for their pets, stay alive. They will also be willing to put themselves at risk of dying for their pets. There's well documented research around people staying in very dangerous domestic violence situations when there's not safety available for their animals, people refusing to evacuate in disasters, people staying on streets in horrific weather conditions when they are forced to pick between safe shelter and their animals. So I think animal welfare folks have really grasped this and done a wonderful job of sort of working to support both ends of the leash, I hear it called. Sometimes there's increasing numbers of humane societies and vet clinics that are hiring social workers to work on the human pieces that help keep those animals and people too healthy and well and together. They have intake diversion programs at shelters, which are what? Somebody comes with struggle crisis. Are there resources that can help you keep your pets? And then animal inclusive housing as a
Exactly.
whole. There's places, I want to give a shout out to, like, the Michelson Foundation, which really works with housing providers around how can we have this be a win-win, to have affordable housing and your business is thriving and you're doing what you set out to do. They've done research around pet damage, like for rental properties,
What did you call it? The
and sort of,
Michelson Foundation?
oh, the Mike Michelson Foundation.
So,
Yeah.
is that nationwide or just in your
Yes,
area?
yes. They're a
Oh,
national nonprofit and they're
okay.
really working toward pet inclusive housing and trying to tackle what are the barriers to housing. And so if you fast forward from that sort of aha moment when I was doing risk assessment, I'm a geek, so amongst our nerd, whatever, I don't know what the right word for it now is. I've always been, I love theory and thinking and can hang out there. But at the end of the day, I'm like a practical, like rubber meets, like, what does this mean for people, for animals, for communities? And how does this support them in figuring out how to get things going in the directions they need? And so my PhD social work, I went to an Access to Veterinary Care conference held by the ASPCA. And while I was in academia, I was still very much working in community-based work. I was working with basically helping animal welfare and human service organizations to kind of partner to help keep people and animals together and finding ways to collaborate and build resources that would kind of serve both, rather than like the animal side dealing with the animal, the people side dealing with the people, and no communication happening. So in that period of time, I did a study with a healthcare system, a private nonprofit regional called ProMedica, like big hospitals, primary care, but very focused on what they call the social determinants of health. So kind of like the social factors that help us stay healthy and well. So them, and then the Toledo Humane Society, the biggest Northwest Ohio animal shelter, paired up, and we got a grant from the Kenneth A. Scott Charitable Trust to have shelter animals placed as emotional support animals for adults referred by their healthcare providers who were living with a chronic mental health condition, at risk of social isolation. Most of them were on disability because they were affected by their health condition to the point where they struggled to work, so fixed income, and all of them wanting an animal and feeling like that would be helpful, meeting the criteria under the Fair Housing Act in the United States for an emotional support animal. But it was really a neat partnership between a healthcare system for people and then the animal shelter full of animals needing homes. So these were homes that would get some extra support. The adoption fee was covered by the grant. They were able to get basic vet care, pet food supplies, and then we had a research study where we looked at anxiety, depression, loneliness, and then we actually, not me, but a colleague of mine, like did saliva samples where we looked at cortisol, which is an indicator of stress, and then oxytocin, the bonding hormone. So all in all, we had 14 people, and we got data before they adopted their animals, and each of them picked their animals. They worked with the animal shelters adoption staff real closely. It's matchmaking, because I'm often asked, well, like, what makes a good emotional support animal? And of course, always my first response is, I'm not an animal. I don't temperament screen. I'm a social. What I would say is it's a relationship. It's matchmaking. One person's amazing emotional support animal could be another person's emotional stress animal.
Right.
Like when I think about who gravitated to what, like
Right.
we had a younger person who wanted a dog who was going to be active and like get him out of, like, he had struggles with anxiety, just always kind of revving, and wanted to get that energy out, but didn't like being out by himself, like someone who would play catch with him and just be up with him from dusk till dawn.
Mhm.
And then I had a couple other people who wanted more like couch potato,
Yeah.
like dog who would sit with them while they watched their shows and like go outside and go bathroom and maybe like walk up and down the block a little bit, come back in. If the high energy dog had been switched with one of the couch potato dogs, those
That
placements
would
would
have,
have had, I
right.
think, dramatically different
That
outcomes. It
would have
was
created
the
so much stress. And
yeah,
I'm
it's
glad,
relationship.
right. And I'm glad you say that, because people, they really do pigeonhole the whole emotional support animal thing, which is a very different than a service animal. But I, for one, snakes relax me so much. If I can just, and I know they freak people out. So if I told
They
people,
do.
hey, snakes are great emotional support animals, that is not,
For you,
yeah,
that could be an effective
exactly.
companion for it. And
Exactly.
that's the piece, is an accommodation. I mean, emotional support animals are recognized as accommodations under the US Fair Housing Act. And I'm also not a lawyer. I work closely with some. I do expert witness work for the US Department of Justice Civil Rights Division on emotional support animal cases, all of which are actually discrimination. So when the person was eligible to have their animal and was basically barred from, like, discriminated against, not permitted to have their animals. So I mean, I think there's a lot of high profile news cases out there, that clickbait kind of, the emotional support. Peacock got a lot of attention, the crocodile. What do I think about it? Could that relationship between that animal and that human help to reduce that person's health or mental health distress or struggles? Yes. Yes, it possibly could, because if the person is bonded to that animal, committed to taking care, that can cause those physical, social, psychological, emotional benefits that we get when we have that bond. Should we be having these animals in these roles? That is a whole other conversation. Like why we have animals who we've already domesticated, who can't live independently, literally losing their lives for lack of homes. So why would we be taking animals out of environments that they can live in on their own? I think there's bigger questions that are the more important ones to be asking. And then there's always the exception, like there's no wildlife place, and I saved this little squirrel and nobody was going to take him. If I left him there, he would die, but he imprinted on me, and now he's my emotional support squirrel. Am I a horrible person? Of course you're not a horrible person. Like there's always the exceptions. Does that mean we should all climb trees and like kidnap baby squirrels so we can have emotional support squirrels? Absolutely not. You know, we can find a reasonable exception to so many things. So you wouldn't believe, like every time there's some sort of emotional support, like I'll get like 20, 30 emails, like news, people just like, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
And what I think is exactly what I told you. Is it possible? Sure. And snakes, is that the typical emotional support animal that we would think of? No. Is there any, can we cohabit? Many people have snakes as companions. There's precedent for that. They don't typically, I don't know, I shouldn't say don't ever destroy property, but I mean, for somebody that has benefits and they have, like, we in research we call it an affiliation. That's like the funky fancy word, but it's like liking. You're drawn to them. You have pleasant, positive feelings. You get relaxed around them. Some people love the tactile, the smoothness of the softness of their scale, and find the weight around their necks kind of soothing and grounding, and they're very slow typically. So if that's the reaction that somebody has, that absolutely could provide some benefit that could offset the struggles that person has due to a health or a mental health condition. And that's what it is. It's the relationship. And I know I don't know why we collectively with like why a relationship can be helpful. Like we get that, we being human service, I want to be real clear, because like I said, I think animal welfare has gotten it, been running with it and trying to lift both ends of the couch. And I think human service side needs to get with the program.
Right.
I think we get service animals. We're starting to get real therapy animals. Yes, we bring them there and we know they can reduce anxiety. They can even help reduce pain. There's all sorts of studies, reasons, stress levels, even not just of patients in hospitals, but staff. So we get bringing them to places. So there's all sorts of good things that are happening, but then somehow we still miss the most powerful piece, which is that interaction that happens between that therapy dog or whatever's and that human, right, that patient or that student or that shooting survivor. And that's the piece that I think, like when we take that to people living with their own animals, then it's like, oh, well, that's just hooey. Like pets aren't helpful for people's health. Well, that's one of two responses I get. Pets are nice for everybody, but they actually don't make a difference in human health. Or, oh my gosh, they make such a difference. You actually get paid to research that. Don't people know that already? Who the heck needs a study on that? Like, what's wrong with people? Don't they, like, haven't they ever lived with an animal and know that their animal helps them through things? So I get like these very polarized responses.
So Janet, does, and I don't think I asked you this before, but does Open Door Veterinary Collective, do they help to,
Yes.
okay. So
Yes.
that's
So kind
what,
of jumping, the study that I did that I was mentioning to you, at the end of it, people had decreased loneliness, increased quality of life, decreased anxiety and depression. Now, mind you, these were people not randomly assigned, there was no control group. So, over a year, lots of things can happen in a person's life. Fortunately, we did qualitative interviews. So, before we even had any of the data analyzed, we asked them, what do you like? What was this like for you? All of them, like, this made such a difference living with my animal. Like, was there some stress? Yes. Actually, their stress went up a little bit in the first few months, something to the effect of, oh my gosh, I can barely manage myself, and now I have another living being depending on me. So they all talked about some variation of that, and also then kind of getting through it and having this be a tremendously beneficial thing for their mental health. And we'd go in and we would just ask them, interact with your animal for 10 minutes. Like, whatever you guys do that's pleasant or fun. Like, I tried to script it a little bit, like, so that it could be standardized, like everybody, but people are like, no, my animal, my cat doesn't like to be held up. He wants to sit next to me. And I scratch his back and I rub under his chin, where somebody else is like, no, my kitty's like up here on my neck. And like the dog people had, so I was like, all right, do your thing for 10 minutes. And I got out of the way, because these were not therapy animals. These were animals who were great with their people and just fine as general pets. They weren't causing any disturbances in the apartments. We didn't have any complaints or anything like that about it. But the cats hid from me. Some of the dogs barked. They weren't like, so we got out of there. So we get saliva at the beginning. They did their 10 minutes. Saliva at the end. What we saw was a visual pattern of the stress hormone went down, and that bonding hormone that's associated, the oxytocin that's associated with drops in heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, went up. Okay. And the reason we picked 10 minutes is because that's like what they measure in some of the therapy dog studies. So where are we going with this? Like, if you live with your animal, they're around you. Like, I have cats in various spots around me right now. That's not the same as focusing on having an interaction with them for 10 minutes. But having a positive interaction has the potential, much like we're seeing with visits, therapy dog visits. And I should add the caveat, there's also therapy animals who work with licensed therapists, like a mental health one, a physical health one. So that's yet another kind. But the whole idea of helping people keep their animals in their home so they can have these interactions and reduce the stressors. This little study, actually, just because it was one of the first that really looked methodically at emotional support animals, and it was over 12 months. It got grabbed by social media. It was cited in Discover Magazine, Psychology Today. Most people with emotional support animals are just trying to quietly get through their day, and animals functioning as emotional support animals may not even be recognized as such. People don't need that unless they're trying to get into rental housing that prohibits pets. And an animal that is functioning as an ESA is not considered a pet. Now, the person doesn't have the right to take them in public, but they do have the right to have them in housing. We just launched a emotional support animal resource page with free trainings for professionals, like a fact sheet, sample letters, just trying. There's also this cottage industry of places selling ESA letters online, like, oh, get your own emotional support animal letter and you can take your pet anywhere. You can't. I mean, it's not what an emotional support animal, that's not your right having an ESA. Your right is to have that animal in your housing. So all of that's one of the ways Open Door. I went to this Access to Care conference. I connected with the woman who created Open Door, who I actually knew from other projects. Long story less long, I came on full time as their director of veterinary social work. And a big part of my role is working with human health and social service providers to help lift up basically our end of the couch, like help keep people and pets together when it is a relationship that has benefit and that mutual well-being. Maybe they're going through a tough spot, but if we can collaborate, get them through the animal benefits, of course, by staying in a good, loving home, but the person benefits. And that's, again, we get it when we say therapy animal, but somehow if we take the phrase therapy animal away and we just say interaction with an animal, relationship with an animal, then it's like, oh no, like that's not legitimate. It's very peculiar. And so some of the things I mentioned, the page, we have a social work hub that is created not for people who do animal assisted therapy, but regular human service. Maybe they have their own animals, but they're not specialists and they just are like, oh my goodness, my client just went into hospice and nobody will take her dog, or he fell and broke a hip, or my client, they're being evicted and it's the kids, they adore their animal and they're devastated. What do we do? So this is a resource for people across different kinds of human services. The primary care doctor who's working with somebody isolated and would benefit. So on the hub, of course, we have the ESA link. We also have what's called pethelpfinder.org. And if you're familiar with United Way as a partner of ours, they have 211, which is this absolutely phenomenal, love it. You can put it in your phone, your computer, you can call and they'll look up for you, or you can search it yourself, but it's a giant database, national, local, regional. You just met a family and somebody needs shoes, they need a coat, they need help with the utility shut off. Where are the hot meals for this zip code? Who's got help for people that need clothes for an interview? There's just, they help people connect to healthcare, mental health care, addiction treatment, shelter, housing shelter. So they do all of those things. Pet Help Finder is like the animal counterpart of that. We don't have an operator that can answer it 24/7, but it is searchable. It's constantly being uploaded with new information. Every source is vetted, so we've reached out, we've screened it, we've made sure it's like legit. And the three sort of areas that you can search in are the things that we typically have been asked for help around the most, which is temporary crisis foster, pet food and supplies, and affordable vet care. And that's not to say those are the only things, but those are kind of the three buckets you can search. If you still can't find something, then you can email us and we will work with to see what resources we can pull together. So it's kind of like, on the one hand, helping people with emotional support animal eligibility for people who are legitimately eligible. Like I said, there's groups like the Michelson Foundation doing great things just to pet inclusive housing, helping people be with their animals and live with them, and having that opportunity to have that relationship and support. But then how do we mitigate those stress factors? Because those stressors are for real. Grief support's another one. Most of us, our lifespans are longer than our animals. And for the same reasons that we feel so powerfully, we stick around for them when they're our main support, and we lose them, that can be devastating too. So certainly pet grief, pet loss, but Pet Help Finder is about, okay, how do we help? Okay, they've gotten their animal. How do we help them stay together?
Right.
Like that's the
Right.
first step. They've gotten in their housing, or they've gotten their animal they've adopted, or however that's happened. So I do a lot of outreach to healthcare systems, primary care, shelters for folks who are unhoused. And probably the thing I more than anything is just ask. I talk about asking the three questions. Do you have an animal or a pet? Are they helpful for you? any stressors or worries. If you just ask those three things, and even better, put them in your forms as a human health or social service agency, so people don't have to remember to ask. For so many people, that is a really important part of their life that they don't even think to bring up, because they figure we being, again, the human service side, we're not going to do anything to help.
Right.
When in fact we can, and we starting to, and we have tools.
Right.
So I just like, hats off to folks like you who have these kinds of platforms to elevate these
Right.
things, because
Right.
it's so needed.
Well, thank you, Janet, for speaking with us about it. So when we spoke originally, you gave me some links. And so before we end, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that all of these resources will be included in the show notes. I learned a new one today, the Michelson Foundation. So I'm definitely going to include that.
A pet help,
pethelpfinder.com,
yes,
and then also the social work hub on the Open Door Consults
yeah,
website. And then another one that you had given me previously that I am going to include so people can look it up and look at it on their own, but it's the Healthy Bond for Life through the American Heart Association. So
yes.
all of those resources are going to be included. And Janet, before we end, do you just want to give us the website for Open Door Consults? And again, these resources will be included on the show notes.
Yeah, so Open Door Consults is the overarching mission of Open Door, kind of just what it sounds like, is to increase access to veterinary care and other supports that help keep pets and their people together and healthy and basically living their best lives. So as I said, I'm a social worker, so I work a lot at the human service end, but there's a number of incredible colleagues I work with, working with the animal welfare and veterinary areas to innovate and help support folks working in those areas. So the Open Door, the main website is opendoorconsults.org. Open Door Consults is one word, .org. It's a national nonprofit. We have a number of trainings. Some of them are free on demand. I mentioned for emotional support animals, we have a basic one, and then two that one focuses on the research around benefits of animals, and the other focuses on people's rights around the Fair Housing Act for an emotional support animal, people who are eligible. The second one I actually do with a disability rights attorney who has expertise in that area. But there's trainings for veterinarians, there's resources for payment plans that have been studied and shown practices that have used them get paid. So all sorts of resources on there, and any questions about any of those, reach out to me. If it's not my area, I can certainly help connect you with the person that has the best skill set.
Right. And I'll also include your email address as a resource. I want to thank Janet again for joining us from Open Door Veterinary Collective. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the resources. Again, I'm going to include all of that information in the show notes. And just thank you again. And thank you for everything you're doing for animals and for people. There really is that connection, and you're definitely a proponent. So thank you so much.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for having me, and thank you for this incredible platform with like the best name ever. Don't we all strive to be resilient animals? I love it, and I love that you have this and are able to amplify all the different ways that, you know, people and animals are able to have better lives and mutually supportive well-being.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We'll listen again for another episode of the Resilient Animal Podcast.